the last aspect of the Reformations we need to consider is the Henrician Reformation. This is what happened when King Henry VIII of England famously converted to Protestantism, and thus started what we call the Henrician Reformation. This led to a lot of religious tensions as he dissolved the monasteries as part of this. So he abolished monasteries, seized all their land, made himself extremely rich in the process. Further problems came because one of his children was Catholic, that's Mary, and two were Protestant, that's Edward and Elizabeth. Now, Mary earned the nickname Bloody Mary for her handling of the Protestants in England when she became Queen Mary. She was the only surviving child of Henry VIII by his first wife, Catherine of Aragon. Catherine was very well educated, she was also very pious, and she made sure that her daughter Mary received a good humanist education. She knew Latin, she knew lots of modern languages too. Now, when Henry VIII died, his son Edward took over as king, but Edward died on the 6th of July 1553, and he left the crown of England in his will to his Protestant cousin, who was called Lady Jane Grey. This was in direct contravention to law, specifically the 1544 Succession Act that King Henry VIII implemented. Mary was able to rally support, and she was proclaimed Queen in London on the 19th of July. The motives of those who were supporting who was, well, soon to be Queen Mary, were mixed, but a love of the old religion does seem to have been a big factor. Those who were hostile to Mary's reign declared that both her religion and the fact that she was not married would produce problems, which, did turn out to be true. Although Mary made it known at once that she intended to restore Catholicism as the official religion of England, the formal reconciliation of England to the Pope in Rome did not take place until as late as 1554. But this was actively welcomed in some areas. The way Henry VIII converted to Protestantism is a bit shady even today. That's the famous, this is an oversimplification, but famously the Pope wouldn't let him divorce his first wife, Catherine of Aragon, and he wanted to marry Anne Boleyn, and so he became Protestant, and he was able to do so. I mean, that's only part of the story. Take an early modern Europe class and you will learn all about it, but that's why it's famous. So because of this kind of shady way that he did convert to Protestantism, a lot of people were opposed to Protestantism in England. But Mary's willingness to pursue Protestants to even to death has sullied her reputation. In saying that, her attitude towards heretics is pretty typical of rulers of this time. As we know, there was a belief at the time that ridding the realm of a few bad apples would save the remainder. But she gets the nickname Bloody Mary, even though this behaviour was pretty common in the late 16th century. Mary was the first woman to be crowned as ruler of England. And this also gave rise to a number of anxieties. This was made worse when she decided to get married. In 1553, she decided she was going to marry the Prince of Spain. He was later to become a king, but Philip of Spain. And this prompted a rebellion. So there was an element of xenophobia, hatred of Spain, dislike of Mary's religious policy, and there was lots of plotting, such as to replace her with her Protestant sister Elizabeth. Although Elizabeth was not found to be involved in this plot, she was still imprisoned and regarded with suspicion. But, regardless, Mary married Philip in 1554. Their marriage went out without a hitch, and for a while everything went well. The reason why we tend to know her as Bloody Mary is because in 1563, John Foxe published his book Acts and Monuments, which is known popularly as the Book of Martyrs. And this was one of the great bestsellers of the time. And his judgment of Mary as bloody is what has endured. Foxe was writing the history of English Protestantism, but also providing it with a martyrology. That is what we call like a history of the martyrs. So he had a vested interest in stressing her cruel practices, how terrible she was persecuting people, how people were burned and imprisoned, murdered, famished, racked, tormented, and how the people who were punished in this way were really Christ's saints. So because this was a popular book, this has kind of become our biased judgment of her. Failure, cruelty, these kind of dominated the assessments of Mary's reign and the Catholic restoration of England until well into the 20th century. Mary died very young though, and so her sister succeeded, and this is Queen Elizabeth I. Now, Elizabeth was very wary of another Mary, Mary. This was Mary, Queen of Scots. So Mary Tudor, who was Queen Mary, this Mary, is different from Mary, Queen of Scots. Mary's a super popular name in this time period, so there's multiple Marys. Mary, Queen of Scots, had a really good claim to the English throne, and she was Catholic. She'd also briefly been Queen of France, because remember, she was married to Francis. So Mary, Queen of Scots, was plotted against Elizabeth, but then she was usurped because, partly because Scotland converted to Protestantism too, and ultimately Mary, Queen of Scots, ended up beheaded by Elizabeth I. She had Spanish backing in her attempt to claim the English throne and the Scottish throne, in particular from King Philip of Spain. I don't know what number he was. King Philip of Spain. Philip had received the backing of the Pope, and he was promised a huge monetary payment if he had managed to invade England. So Philip was like, okay, I'll see that. And he assembled a huge fleet of ships in Lisbon, which is actually in Portugal, but anyway. And he intended to attack the English coast with this huge fleet of ships and use them to transport Spanish troops from the Netherlands, which at that time period was actually the Spanish Netherlands, it was under Spanish control, and invade Britain by land. This was called the Armada, or correctly, La Felicissima Armada. There's around 130 ships. It's one of the biggest fleets ever assembled, and it left Lisbon in 1588. It was a disaster for Spain. To begin with, English pirates delayed them by burning their supplies, and then the disaster continued. The Spanish ships couldn't get very close to shore because of the technology at the time, and then the fleet, when they docked in the Netherlands, were scattered by the English fire ships. So as the name suggests, they were ships that were put on fire and lobbed fire, and the Spanish ships all were like, we don't want to catch fire, and sailed away. And so they sailed away to escape being set on fire, and this brought them into the English Channel, where it was really windy, and they got blown off course. So they decided, okay, we'll go and meet each other at a new rally point in the North Sea. So to do this, they decided the great idea was to sail around Scotland and Ireland and get back to where they had been. And this actually was a terrible idea. This is a map of shipwrecks in Ireland from the Spanish Armada alone. There are even more in Scotland. So if you were at elementary school in Ireland, you would learn all about these ships because they've been archaeologically investigated. So they got sent, of course, by really bad weather, and then they tried to sail around Scotland and Ireland, which was a really bad idea if you didn't know what you were doing. If you knew what you were doing, yeah, there were loads of havens and harbours, but if you didn't know what you were doing, the turbulent seas and the winds were going to drive you onto the rocks, and yeah, you're going to get shipwrecked. And if you survive the shipwreck, it could be even worse for you, because the law at the time in Ireland was that it was kind of finders keepers as long as there were no survivors. And these ships were like weighted down with booty. So there were no survivors, if you catch my drift. Anybody who made it to shore was killed. So if you made it to shore, wasn't that great. Now, it, in all honesty, wasn't a very significant event in terms of history, but the English have made it out and romanticized it to be like this massive victory, when really it was the weather and the fact that these ships were far too close to a very rugged shore. But if you watch like that movie with Kate Blanchett in it about Queen Elizabeth, it's all about their success during the Armada. I mean, it was a great propaganda cause for the Protestants in English, a victory over the Catholic Spaniards, even though it wasn't really them. About half of this fleet actually straggled back to Spain. Like nearly half of them were wrecked on the coast. And war and tensions continued apace. So this means, as I showed you on the previous video, what Europe looked like around the year 1560. This is what Europe looks like by 1648. It is, bits of it are looking pretty familiar to us today. Kingdom of France is looking pretty familiar to what we would consider France today. Likewise, England and Portugal. But then, we talked about Italy last week. And it's, of course, all split up into these city-states. But just look at what happened in the Holy Roman Empire. It is pretty messy, and a lot of that is due to these overlapping religious and political tensions. Okay, then, that's it for this week, and we'll be with the Age of Exploration next week, which is when Europe takes its problems global.